Welcome to the Last Days Book Club. Today we start a new book entitled I Will Die Free, written by Noble Alexander with K. Rizzo. This book tells the remarkable story of Noble Alexander, a young pastor, and his life in a Cuban prison where he was falsely accused in 1962 of plotting to assassinate Fidel Castro. He was determined to fight to stay alive and remain faithful to his Lord inside the very gates of hell. Denied sleep, given maggot-infested gruel to eat, beaten unmercifully, and forced to labor beyond the normal limits of human endurance, the pastor remained unbroken and more determined than ever to see the cross triumph behind concrete walls of unimaginable human misery. From a place where death is often preferred to life comes a stunning testimony of persecution and perseverance that will awe and inspire all who listen to Noble Alexander's story with the eternal truth that God reigns. The Last Days Book Club presents stories designed to strengthen our faith by looking at examples of real men and women who choose to steadfastly trust God in the face of persecution, suffering, and even death. 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 12 reminds us that all that will live godly in Jesus Christ will suffer persecution. We are now living in the most trying times of Earth's history. But as Christ himself proclaims in Matthew 24 and verse 8, all these are but the beginning of sorrows. And we can take comfort, knowing that the current state of affairs in the world will soon usher in the second coming of Jesus. And if we remain faithful, soon and very soon, as 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 17 informs us, we shall be lifted up to meet him in the skies, and so shall we forever be with our Lord, when God shall wipe away all tears from our eyes, and there shall be no more death, neither sorrow, nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away, as is revealed to us in Revelation chapter 21 and verse 4. Today we begin our reading of I Will Die Free with chapter 1 entitled 5 Minutes from Hell. Even as I gazed out over the darkened auditorium, a strange mixture of exhilaration and sadness pervaded my thoughts. Exhilaration following a successful opening meeting of the youth revival in my church, and sadness over the chronic fear I sensed in the upturned faces of the young people before me. Phrases like living in the last days, a time of trouble such as never was, or the evil times in which we live, no longer apply to the future by and by, I thought. For these Christian youth, the evil times are here, and the troubled times are now. They had come to the meeting to be fed, to be reassured of their part in God's eternal plan of salvation. Had I satisfied their hunger? Had I met their needs? Did I reassure them? Did I give them strength to face the threats that pervaded every aspect of their lives? I didn't know. I hoped I had, but I didn't really know. The chairs stood empty, the hymnals closed. Suddenly, I sensed I was not alone. Placing my Bible in my briefcase, I straightened and turned to face the intruder. Pastor Vasquez, the church's senior minister, strode up the center aisle. "Ah, Pastor Alexander, you are still here. How did the meeting go?" "Very well, I think," I smiled, trying to shed the strange foreboding that haunted me all evening. "It comforts me to know that the forces of heaven will triumph, that Satan and evil will be defeated in the end." "Yes," Pastor Vasquez agreed, "I know." The thoughts we didn't utter spoke more loudly than the words we shared. "How many would you say attended the youth meeting this evening?" "Oh, about 200, give or take a few." "Then it was worth it." Pastor Vasquez and I had debated for some time whether or not, in the face of the increased persecution from Castro and his supporters, to cancel the planned series of meetings. I glanced at the pastor, his face shrouded in the shadows. "Oh yes," I assured him, "it was worth it. If you could have seen the despair in some of their faces, the uncertainty, even terror. I can't explain." I know, Pastor Vasquez nodded. I sensed the same disquieting tension in the adult meeting. The new communist regime had been hovering over organized religion in Cuba like an anticipated tropical hurricane. A number of times, I had been detained and questioned by G2 men, Cuba's newly formed KGB. Pastor Vasquez cautioned me that these interrogations regarding friends and acquaintances who had escaped from the island could lead to my eventual arrest. 2 days earlier, the pastor and I had considered canceling our series of meetings rather than risk further persecution from Castro and his men. "Things aren't good, Noble. They aren't good at all," Pastor Vasquez warned. "I have half a mind to postpone in spite of your protests to the contrary." As senior pastor, the final decision was ultimately his. But I hated to see our long hours of preparation come to naught. "I share your worries," I hastened to assure him. "But can we afford to let this opportunity go by? Because of what is happening, how long do we have? Who can tell but that these meetings may be the spark that sets the country on fire for the Lord?" The Christian church in communist Cuba was operating on borrowed time. Daily, Castro and his henchmen harassed first one denomination, then another. Catholics, Protestants, Baptists, Seventh-day Adventists, it didn't matter who. Christianity of any kind drew the Cuban people's alliance away from him to a higher power that could create martyrs and dissension and could ultimately threaten Castro's government. After praying together, Pastor Vasquez decided to take the risk. We would faithfully do our part, and God would have to do the rest. Considering the results of the first meeting, the decision had been sound. In silence, Pastor Vasquez and I walked to the door. I paused and glanced back at the darkened room. My first revival meeting. Yes, I told myself, it had been a success. Together, we stepped out into the warm night air. "It is too bad that Iraida and your son could not be here tonight to share in your happiness," the pastor commented as we made our way to the church parking lot. "I just hope Hubert isn't coming down with a tropical fever of some kind," I said. When Iraida couldn't get him to stop crying, she thought it best to stay at home with him. Yes, well, Pastor Vasquez chuckled. That's the way it is with babies, you know, and new mothers. Guiltily, I recalled my impatience at Iraida for the late start that we had gotten. Then to have our 2-year-old start crying and refuse to stop even before I'd started the car's engines. I was certain I'd never reach the church in time for the sermon, let alone in time for song service. If the truth were known, when Iraida had offered to stay home with him, I leaped at the suggestion. It was for the best, I'm sure, I demurred. Pastor Vasquez and I shook hands and said goodnight. I watched him cross the parking lot to his car. Then I climbed into mine and shut the door. Maneuvering the automobile into the late evening traffic, I glanced at my watch. 84 miles. An hour and a half should do it, I thought. Automobiles, trucks, buses, and bicycles jostled for position amid the usual throng of pedestrians in the main street of Matanza. By the time I reached Marianao, where I lived, the streets would be dark and empty. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed my son's hand-knitted sweater and baby bottle. Ah, yes, I thought, Iraida's purse. I reached onto the front seat and removed my wife's beige handbag from where I'd stuffed it. In her haste to get Hubert back to our apartment, she had forgotten it, along with the sweater and the bottle. Ah, Iraida, what a good sport, I thought. I knew it wasn't easy, trying to balance being a mother of a 2-year-old and a pastor's wife at the same time, especially during a series of meetings. I'll have to be sure to tell her how much I appreciate her when I get home. Glancing into the rearview mirror, I noticed a blue and white Oldsmobile tailing me, but gave it little thought. At the edge of Matanza, the traffic thinned, and the moist, woolen blanket atmosphere of the city lifted. I rolled down my window and let the island trade winds blow through the car. Miles rolled beneath my wheels as I relived aloud the evening meeting. Step by step, I reviewed the story I'd told regarding the fall of Lucifer, his desire to be like God, and his rebellion and expulsion from heaven. 1/3. Think about that number. 1/3 of heaven's angels believed Lucifer's lies. How the loving Creator must have mourned the loss of his children. He's a God of peace, not of war. I paused and smiled. I'd felt the Holy Spirit's presence in the auditorium that evening. The young people had felt his presence too. I knew by their response. A surge of joy and triumph filled me. Yes! I pounded the steering wheel with my fist. Praise God, I shouted out of the window, honking the horn in celebration. You used me, Father, to touch their lives. Thank you, thank you, thank you. What an incredible honor, I thought, to be used of God. The quiet drive gave me time to come down off the natural high preachers get after such experiences. By the time I saw the lights of Mariano, I had to fight to keep my eyelids open. The empty streets narrowed and darkened as I passed the downtown section of the city. Again I glanced through my rearview mirror and recognized the automobile directly behind me, the same one I had noticed before leaving Matanza. As I entered an alleyway less than a block from my home, my headlights illuminated a second blue and white 1957 Oldsmobile parked in the roadway. Thinking I'd need to back out onto another street, I slowed to a stop. Immediately, the car tailing me pulled in behind me, blocking my only available exit. Before I could decide what to do, two men, dressed as civilians with guns in hand, jumped out of the rear vehicle and approached my side of the car. Oh no, I thought. Not another questioning. Not at this hour of the night. I'm so tired. The taller man bent down and peered into my open window. Are you Umberto? He asked. Noble, I replied. Nevertheless, you will accompany us to G2 headquarters. We have a few questions to ask. It should take no more than 5 minutes or so, the man explained, if you will come with us. At the sight of his Red Star gun and the set of his jaw, I knew his invitation was not open to discussion. I sighed, climbed out of my car, and walked to the other vehicle as ordered. I could see the outline of a third officer in the driver's seat. Once there, I got into the back seat. I knew the routine well. The back seats of these 1957 Oldsmobiles were outfitted with manacles, handcuffs attached to the floor of the car. From outside the vehicle, it looked to passers-by as if the person in the back seat was loose, when in reality, he was securely cuffed. The first officer slid in beside me on my left and aimed his gun straight at my heart. The second officer rounded the back of the car and flanked me on the right. The routine didn't bother me. I was used to it by now, though I wished they had picked a more civilized time of day in which to conduct their interrogations. During the 20-minute drive to G2, Castro's KGB headquarters, the policemen remained silent. I tried to recall my every move during the last 48 hours, hoping to find a clue for this latest detention. Had one of my friends or parishioners fled the country, and I was again being questioned regarding their absence? If so, no one had mentioned it. I had been so busy preparing for the meetings. Nothing came to my mind that could possibly incriminate me in any way. I would later learn that I was but one of hundreds of Cubans arrested as political agitators during the early days of Castro's regime. At G2 headquarters, my captors wasted no time. They whisked me through the doors and down a long, dark corridor. In my mind, I imagined the gray stone corridor to look much like the proverbial passage leading to the abyss of Revelation. We entered a brightly lighted room, and a policeman placed me in front of a camera. A card with the number 30954 was placed on my chest. At that moment, I never imagined how deeply those numbers would burn into my memory. Face left, the lieutenant barked. I obeyed. The camera flashed. Face right. Again, I obeyed. Officer, I tried to explain, I have a letter in my wallet from General Samuel Gonzalez Rodriguez, a character reference. The officer closest to where I stood slapped the side of my face and shouted, "Shut up! Speak only when you're spoken to." My hand flew to my stinging cheek. I staggered backward to maintain my balance. Now, I knew I was in more serious trouble than in times past. This will be more than a 5-minute detention, I thought, as one of the policemen grabbed my left hand and pressed each of my fingertips into the ink pad, then onto an official arrest sheet. "Empty the contents of your pockets onto the table," the officer demanded. Dazed, my mind switched into automatic. Somewhere beyond myself, I heard my watch, my wallet, and my car keys hit the metal tabletop. I thought about my car, parked illegally in the alleyway, and wondered if the traffic cops would tow it away in the morning. If only I could get word to Iraida. She could go pick it up. The officer sifted meticulously through my wallet, reading every scrap of paper within. He even read the message written on the back of my wife's picture. "Take off your clothing. Everything." The man inspected each item of clothing, tearing at the seams and the hems of each garment, searching for contraband of any kind. Satisfied there was none, he handed everything to a waiting policeman. I watched the second officer scoop up my belongings from the table and carry them to a locked closet. As he stuffed them inside and relocked the door, I thought, there goes Umberto Noble Alexander. There goes my identity. No, that's not true, I reasoned. My name is recorded in the books of heaven. I lifted my chin and squared my shoulders at the thought. They may strip me of every earthly possession, but my identity as a royal son of the King of the universe is eternally mine. The door to the hallway opened, and a barber entered the room. Without a word, he cut off all of my hair, down to the scalp. The photographer shot a second series of pictures. A second barber arrived to shave my face. He held a straight razor to my right cheek and pulled. I cringed from the pain. The blade hadn't been sharpened in years, I was certain. It felt as if the razor was yanking each hair out of my face one strand at a time. He finished the job in 3 strokes. One from my right cheek to my chin, the other from my left cheek to my chin, and the third from the base of my throat to my chin. Blood was streaming down my face by the time he finished. One of the officers shoved a paper towel into my hand. "Here," he ordered. "Clean yourself up with this. Hurry. We haven't much time." The camera flashes blinded me as the photographer barked out his instructions a third time, and I moved accordingly. I was still dabbing at the blood oozing down my face when a guard shoved me into a gray metal chair beside a dilapidated oak desk, where one of the arresting officers sat, his hands poised on the keyboard of an old standard royal typewriter. "Name?" he asked. "Umberto Noble Alexander. Age? 28. Occupation? Youth pastor of the Seventh-day Adventist Church," I replied. The officer mumbled my answers as his fingers clicked in a hunt and peck fashion across the keyboard, recording my answers. Address? 146th Street East 49. Married? Yes. Wife's name? Iraida Seul Alexander. Children? Umberto D. Alexander. When he had recorded every detail of my life since birth, the lieutenant turned me over to a helmeted policeman. "Follow me," the man ordered. His right hand caressed the butt of his gun as if daring me to refuse. We crossed the room, then walked down a dimly lighted hallway. At the end of the hallway, he opened a heavy metal door. The pungent odor of stale excrement accosted my nose. I followed him down a long flight of narrow stone steps. The atmospheric temperatures dropped as we descended. At the bottom of the stairs, my eyes adjusted to the dim lighting enough that I could make out an empty corridor The sound of our footsteps echoed off the metal doors lining the cement block walls. The hall was broken into short segments, and each segment was barred by a steel door and a set of guards. No one spoke as we approached the first door. Without losing a step, my guard whistled a coded message. A whistled reply came from beyond the barricade. The door slid open, then clanged shut behind us. Not another human being could be seen. Wordlessly, we continued on to the next door and the next, until my guard halted before cell number 6. I had seen no other prisoners, and no prisoners had seen me until the guard shoved me into my new quarters. The heavy metal door clanged shut behind me. A sudden wave of nausea swept across me as I struggled to regain my bearings. The stench was unbearable. I swallowed hard and gasped. I felt as if every pore of my body was being invaded by the choking odor of human excrement. The cell was nothing but a concrete cage. High on the back wall, a vent made of concrete was angled in such a way as to prevent a prisoner from seeing outside his cell. Yet, it allowed for a change of atmosphere from outside the cell. Lower on the same wall, a rusty pipe with a broken faucet dripped stagnant water. There was no toilet and no wash bowl. A hole in the opposite corner was designed to act as a toilet, but it had long since clogged. Piles of excrement lay about barnyard-like. Some piles were hard and old, others were fresh and putrid. In despair, I glanced about my temporary quarters. My eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness, and I sensed I was being scrutinized. A moment later, I saw them. 24 eyes, staring at me from 9 metal bunks chained to 2 of the concrete walls. My mouth dropped open in disbelief as I studied the disheveled and desperate faces about me. A sudden rattling at the door broke the silence. "Llegó carne fresca! Fresh meat has arrived!" The prisoner nearest the door shouted as a large tray slid through a slot at the base of the door. My cellmates dived for the food. One whiff of the putrefied meat, and I knew I couldn't put any of it in my mouth. It stank worse than the human waste strewn about the floor. The arrival of the food loosened my companions' tongues. They craved information from the outside more than their empty stomachs cramped from hunger. "What is happening outside? Did you overhear the guards discussing our release? Castro, will there be a coup? Have you heard anything about an invasion? Will we be freed?" The inmates bombarded me with questions. I told them what little I might have picked up from street gossip and from the state-controlled newspapers. Mostly, I knew nothing about coups or invasions or political threats to the Castro regime. I was a pastor of young people, not a man of the revolution. I did not then appreciate my cellmates' insatiable appetite for fresh information. I would come to in time. After a while, we lapsed into a haunting silence. While no one spoke, our thoughts were of the same things: family, home, and freedom. Hours dragged by. If only I could fall asleep for a few hours, I thought. If only I could escape into the oblivion of a dreamless sleep. But in spite of the darkness, sleep eluded me. The earthy grunts and groans of my fellow prisoners constantly reminded me that I was not alone. I heard someone to my left mumble. A man on my right whispered the words to a familiar Catholic novena. And every few minutes or so, it seemed to me, one of the prisoners shuffled over to the corner of the cell to relieve himself. Since sleep seemed out of the question, I thought about the evening meeting and the young people who had for the first time dedicated their lives to the Lord. I praised God again for their faith, then prayed for each one individually. When I had completed my list of names of people who had come forward at the first meeting of the revival, I leaned my head back against the stone wall and closed my eyes. Who will Pastor Vasquez get to deliver the second youth sermon of the series, I wondered. I hated to have the meetings close because of my detainment, yet I knew that when I finally got released from this hole, all I'd want was a bath and a place to sleep for 24 hours. My thoughts grew hazy and my head rolled to one side. Suddenly a shout startled me. One of the men had cried out in his sleep. I could only imagine the nightmare that triggered the outburst. I was again alert to my surroundings. Perhaps, I reasoned, if I played a few mind games, I could blot out this freakish melodrama I had somehow landed in. Imagining myself in our apartment with Iraida and my son, I walked through each room, examining each piece of used furniture. Mentally, I ran my hand over each nick and scratch. The faces of the relatives who had so generously donated each piece to us when we were married surfaced in my mind. How proud my wife was of our first home, our little love nest, she called it. The vibrant colors in the Afghan on the back of the small brown rocker warmed me. I could see it wrapped around Iraida's shoulders as she sat nursing our son. My eyes misted over at the treasured moment. I leaned my head back against the cement block and sighed. Has Iraida heard about my arrest, I wondered? If not, she must be worried sick by now. If she knows, has she contacted Mama? Iraida's purse. I'd left Iraida's purse on the car seat. Oh no, it will be long gone by morning. Oh well, not much I can do about it now. I found out later that Iraida didn't learn of my arrest for 3 days. Pastor Vasquez, has he heard yet that I'm being detained? Probably not. Not until morning at least. An emptiness filled my innermost soul. Realizing that these thoughts only intensified my misery, I forced them from my mind. I rolled my head from side to side, trying to dislodge a kink in the back of my neck. A minor irritation compared to my surroundings. Some 5 minutes. Obviously, the officials made a mistake. Just how long will they keep me here? I wondered. Questions drifted through my semi-conscious mind. Questions that had no answers. After a while, I stopped thinking and just stared into the impenetrable darkness of the crowded, filthy cell until a bone-weary tiredness overtook my body, numbing my mind. This was February 20th, 1962. Fortunately, I did not know that I would remain a captive in Castro's awful prison system for 22 years. The end. of Chapter 1 of I Will Die Free, entitled 5 Minutes from Hell.